Orthodoxy allowed Iceland to quickly emerge from the crisis, but what is the price of dissent in global politics? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the pros and cons of doing it your way with Iceland's President Ólafur Grímsson. Mr. Grímsson, Iceland seems to be so far removed from the rest of the world. I wonder if you yourself and your people pay any attention to what is happening in the rest of the world. I'm sorry for putting it so bluntly. What I mean, of course, is the major geopolitical events and the geopolitical clash over Syria. Do you think there is any interest in that in your country?
Of course, Iceland is a country which is an integral part of the global community, and the people of Iceland follow very closely events, human rights issues, situation of war and refugees in other parts of the world. So we try to play our part, both through our membership in the United Nations, in NATO, and in other organizations.
I know that your country has a long-standing policy of neutrality. You don't have a standing army in Iceland. I wonder, where does it leave you? Where does it leave Iceland on the issue of military intervention? Do you support it alongside most of the European countries, or do you oppose it?
Well, I don't think it is a true statement to say most European countries favor a military invention. I think, on the contrary, I think most European countries,
leaders have spoken in favor
most
of
European countries have welcomed the results sorry, of the dialogue between Russia and the United States, between President Putin and Obama and your foreign minister and the Secretary of State. And I had a meeting with Ban Ki-moon just 2 days ago, and the essence of our discussion there was our strong support for the United Nations as the legal framework for dealing with these issues. Because if you look at the experience of Iraq, of the Middle East, the situation in Syria and elsewhere, you draw one lesson from this experience, that it's an extremely complicated territory, that you have conflicting historical, religious, and even tribal interests. And for us in the West to try to superimpose our political model on a territory which is almost completely without such a history can lead to disastrous results.
You mentioned, we talked about in the first part about this idea of economic orthodoxy and the pressure of the consensus, and I wonder if you can apply the same idea to the political sphere, because I think many people in Russia would feel similar to what you felt 5 years ago on the economic side, that once you go against the tide, once you challenge the predominant, in this case, Western opinion, you're subjected to all sorts of shaming, you're subjected to all sorts of incriminations. Even if you just dare to voice your opinion, which happens to be different from Western opinion, do you think there's still a price to pay in global politics for not conforming, not going along with predominant Washington consensus?
Of course there can be a price, of course, and that is why I told you before, when I took the decision to go against every government in Europe by allowing the people of Iceland to vote, have a referendum. It was the riskiest decision I've ever taken, and it required a very deep conviction in order to go against, as I said, every government in Europe. But the people of Iceland were behind that decision. And I've often said, when people ask me, what have you learned from your long public service and political career? And the answer is really simple: to trust the people, and I mean the ordinary people, their inner wisdom and their guidance. They are often much more sophisticated in their analysis of what matters than the so-called experts or the leaders of countries. And when we approach other parts of the world, we should also humbly remember in Europe that it was not easy for us to become democratic. It was a costly exercise.
And it took a lot of time.
There were millions and millions of Europeans who died in European wars and European conflicts within the lifetime of myself and my parents in order to make Europe democratic. So for us in Europe to try to tell other parts of the world that there is somehow a magic formula where you can create democracy and a society of human rights in a matter of few years cannot be told from our own European experience. And if it didn't succeed for us, how on earth can we expect others to do it quickly?
It's very refreshing to hear something like that from a Western politician. Now, you just mentioned your long history of public service. Let me ask you a personal question. You just won a record 5th term, and if you serve till the end of that term, you will have been in power for 20 years. And I think there are a lot of leaders around the world, in China, in this country in particular, who have been criticized for so-called clinging to power for much shorter periods of time. And I wonder, how long do you think is too long for a politician to dedicate to his service?
Well, if you had asked me when I was elected whether I thought 20 years was too long, I would have given you unhesitantly the answer, yes, of course it's too long. I intended to step down 2 years ago when my 4th term was over. And I actually made a trip to Antarctica with a group of friends and my wife to take a look at the melting of the ice in Antarctica. And while I was there, I couldn't have been further away. There was a petition started that people wanted me to stand again. Partly because of the uncertainties over many of these issues. And in the end, it became a moral question for myself, because I didn't intend to run for the 5th term. And I faced a situation where people had shown me an extraordinary trust by electing me, and now they wanted me to continue, and I had to repay that trust. Because, as I said before, to me, the bond between somebody who is elected to represent the people, whether it's a president or a member of parliament, it is fundamentally a question of trust, If people elect representatives again, before we start condemning it, we should ask ourselves, maybe there are some wise reasons that people decided to do that. But of course you have attempts of leaders to cling to power and want to be longer in office. But to me, this is fundamentally a service. It's not about power, and it's about trust, where I know I could lose the confidence of the Icelandic people next week. Nothing is given in this. So even if you're elected every 4 years, my experience tells me you have to earn their trust every day, every week, every month.
But I guess the same type of argument could be used by any other leader in any other country, no matter whether it's Iceland, China, for example, or
well, you don't have
Russia.
elections in China the same way as we have in Iceland. I mean,
you have a different historic tradition
yes,
from
sure.
China, and
right.
many Chinese experts and Chinese leaders would argue that what you have in the West or in America is a popularity contest, whereas in China they have a system of qualified choice. You cannot be unexperienced in order to be selected. But
since you're talking about that, I know you are very interested in the intellectual side of politics. A good friend of mine, an American-European businessman, Nicholas Begrudin, published together with a friend of his last year a very interesting book where he was arguing you take the best of the Chinese tradition and the best of the Western tradition and you try to combine those in a new type of political system. But I found it remarkable that a very respected Western businessman and intellectual was arguing that part of the solution to the European and the Western economic and financial crisis was to learn from some of the Chinese practices as well as from our own democratic tradition.
Well, that leads me to actually my final question. I think we have to be open-minded, not just about accepting, some Chinese experience or some Western experience, but also maybe some Russian experience or some African experience. But staying on the issue of Russia and China, I think what's interesting about the relation between the West and these two countries is that some Western countries cannot afford not to deal with Russia and China, but they're sort of embarrassed about having to do that. And what's interesting to me personally about Iceland is that your country seemed to be very open-minded about dealing with, you know, all sorts of countries without passing moral judgments. And I wonder, why don't you feel confined to any particular group? Because obviously you belong to the West, you are a European country with supposedly European democratic values, and yet you can afford to be open-minded about dealing with the world.
No, this is a very interesting point. I have strongly emphasized the need for my country to have constructive dialogue with the United States, and in a few weeks' time I'm bringing many distinguished leaders from the US to come to my country. But at the same time, I have felt it not only necessary but very constructive and positive to engage with Russia and China. This is my third meeting with President Putin on the Arctic in the last few years. In the last 7 or 8 years, almost every year, I had a meeting with the President or the Prime Minister of China. So I don't accept that there is a conflict between being highly engaged with the US, as I have been for many years, or making state visits to Germany and France, and also being very constructively engaged with Russia and China. And when people are perplexed by that view, I ask them the question, how on earth are we going to construct a positive, dynamic global economy and a civilized society in the 21st century without a strong engagement from Russia and China? It's simply not possible.
Well, I think your solution is just treating other countries as equals. But, Mr. President, unfortunately, we have to leave it here. I really appreciate your time here. And to our viewers, please join us again. Same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.